Hi, my name is Daniel Burrows. This is a professional development on lesson planning. I'll be doing it as a flipped classroom to model what that looks like. So to begin with, our lesson plan template uses understanding by design as an inspiration. We also pull from some other things like Madeline Hunter. But in general, many lesson plan templates have common things that make them effective. Understanding by design focuses on the big idea or big picture. It focuses on that end goal in mind, so you know how to get your students where you want them to be. To help you understand the framework, I broke it down this way. I think that every lesson or even series of lessons can be viewed as a collective. And more or less in the beginning, you have your input stage. That's the stage at which you're giving out information to students. Sometimes we want to help students find their own information, and the teacher is not giving anything. Other times, the teacher, maybe for whatever reason, needs to give that information and needs to come from them. Maybe so it's heard best or one way, or maybe they're really effective at saying it. More or less, either way, that information cannot just stay in that stage, in that input stage. As students read or as they're listening to you, they need to start applying what they're learning. So the second stage of a lesson or series of lessons is the application. The way this works is students start pulling apart that information you gave them. They start playing with it. They start thinking about it. They start thinking about it in very critical ways, and they start problem solving. If you give them a good framework for them to start applying this information, you're really scaffolding their knowledge and understanding of it. And finally, to end cap all of it, you have a production phase. This is something that they produce, something that they use or do. It's a creative stage. It should empower students. It should have some student choice and voice involved. Students should do something ultimately with that input information. If you gave them information and asked them to do nothing with it, besides just answer some base level questions, then that's not rigorous. That's a very low end recall retell skill. We need to think of information and content as concepts. We need to think, what are the big skills that we want students to know? And that's that big idea. That's our big understanding. So, understanding by design helps us see the forest. The forest is the very big picture. That could be a very foundational standard. It could be a series of standards. It could be overlapping standards. Whatever it is you want the students, the big idea to see, that's your forest. If you just threw students into the forest, they'd probably get lost. That big idea needs to be broken down. They need to have time to explore. They need to have a reason to explore that big idea or that forest. That's your essential questions. That's going to inspire your inquiry. What's the reason to begin with to even go into the forest to learn about this content? And then what specifically do you want students to see as they're going through the content? These are the trees. These are your learning targets. These are going to make up your forest in general when you put enough of them together. And then students will understand that big idea. And then a lesson in general, you can prepare students ahead of time. That's, hey, what's in their backpack before they step in? What is it that they need to know? You need to know what's in their backpack to begin with, so they're prepared or not. You need to have a space for students to self-discover. And this is your body. This is the application of that input knowledge. And then finally, you need to have some sort of closure to that journey, some sort of ending. What is the product that they produce? Can they find their way back through that forest? Did they actually master the material? Do they know? What is it that you want them to take with you? So this visual helps me understand when I go to create a lesson, what does it all even mean? Because if you start very big and broadly, you could get lost too, not just your students. So to help you along the way, before you even get started, we have our standards. These are vetted. These are what we legally have to teach. We do not have choice in our curriculum. We have choice in how we go about teaching that curriculum. So the first place I'd recommend is literally DPI's standard course of study. I linked it there. You need to spend time and understand all the nuances of your standards to have an idea of the whole scope of curriculum. Until you know it, your students won't be able to know it. Another resource, that other link, is our Anson County Schools curriculum. We have a framework which you can follow. We have pacing guides which you must follow. We have resources which can help you along the way. You don't have to unpack it on your own. In fact, what's in front of us here is an example of an unpacking document. This one is for world history, and it's looking at standard 7.4. If you take it at its surface level, it's a really big idea, how social and economic conditions inspire basically nationalism. That's a really big foundational idea. That's a really big farce. You could get lost in that very easily. Well, DPI has unpacked that standard for us. They gave us suggestions on what students will understand after learning that standard. These more or less will help us with our essential questions. And then we know specifically what students will know. Well, these are our learning targets. These are the trees what we know we need students to see along the way. And we need to find a way to send them through this forest where they're going to get all this information. But we need to do it in a relevant way. So once we looked at our standards, once we know we're on pace and what it is we need to teach, we can start writing our individual lesson plan. So it should at this time be apparent how important that big idea is. Once you have your big idea, you should really vet it and make sure, does it have relevancy? Is it important to kids to even know about? You need to frame it in such a way that it relates to them. It should be a reoccurring concept, a foundational concept, and it should be rounded. It should be revisited. It should have a beginning and end. It should make sense to the students in the scope of curriculum. So this is your forest. You need to see it first before your students are expected to see it. That big idea, that's going to be, again, like our North Star. So now we have our essential questions. This is the reason why we're going into the forest to begin with. Here's some tips on writing good essential questions. Not only do our standards help us inspire these essential questions should be written in such a way that you couldn't Google an answer. That's the easiest way I could relate it. If you can Google an answer with that essential question, it's probably not written in a way that is going to inspire inquiry. It should raise more questions. It should have students think critically. It should make them want to go and pursue an answer, and their answer may be different from other students. So these essential questions often are questions that simply just can't be answered in one word. These are questions that it's worth pursuing. It's worth going in the forest for to begin with. But once you have your essential questions, and for me, in a lesson, if you have a really good one, I don't think you need 5 essential questions. I think that's too much. Maybe in a series of lessons, but in a single lesson in a day, you want to really be on point with what it is you want your students to know. So our learning targets are all the more important. These are the physical things, the physical proof when the lesson's done that you know the students learned. So they should be written in such a way that the students will be able to, or I can statements, that you could ask that student, hey, if the students will be able to understand nationalism and how it impacted X, Y, and Z, I should be able to then, at the end of the lesson, ask the students that question. These learning targets, though, these are content that build concepts. So again, these are the trees. They build up to that big idea. Yes, they're important. They're very important if we need them to move on. For example, if you have a student looking for a bridge, but they're back there lost at the very entrance because they missed the very first left or right, I mean, they're lost from the get-go. So you need to make sure that along the way, you're checking for understanding on these learning targets. That's the crucial part. Before we go any further, it's also important to understand what is the value of accommodations and resources in a lesson plan, not in a lesson. You need to plan ahead of time of your accommodations. And the importance is you're closing that equity gap for learning, for students. Some students are able to learn at a higher rate off the bat. They have more innate skills to be able to learn. Other students, they need accommodations. So we need to even the playing field. And one of the ways you can do that is think of your scaffolding ahead of time. Are you going to differentiate material? How are you going to hit the multiple intelligencies? Are you just going to do a one size fits all lesson for all your kids? And if you are planning for that, that's not good. You need to plan for accommodations ahead of time. So scaffold up and differentiate down. And more importantly, those accommodations must be in compliance with the IEP. So make sure you understand all of those things going into it. It's very important that you're planning for students, not just in general. You're planning for your students. So our assessments and check for understanding. Sometimes we think of assessments as a test you give at the end of the week. Well, that assessment is pretty much worthless if you do nothing with it. If you gave that assessment and that information that you got from the assessment you didn't use in your lesson planning, what was the point of giving the test to begin with? So also, that assessment at the end of the week, you can't use that to teach the things along the way. If students are lost in the forest at the very beginning, but you didn't catch that until it's at the end of the the journey, then you didn't help that student. They were lost and they'll be lost. So we do need to pre-assess ahead of time. You need to know what your students know about this so you can tier your instruction for your kids. You can have uh, formal assessments. You can have summative assessments at the end of the ball, but you also can have informal assessments along the way. Very quick check for understandings. There's also very specific formative assessments you could give that give you specific feedback, like Kahoots and Quizlets and such like that. Just simply asking for a thumbs up, thumbs down is a very good check for understanding. But the idea is, what are we doing with that information? Don't just give an assessment to give an assessment. Don't just check for understanding to check for understanding. Pause and help them along the journey. Don't let them be lost in the forest. So think of rigor as you're assessing. It's not about what you're giving. It's about what the students are producing and what they're doing with it. That's what you're trying to assess, and that's a true assessment. Multiple choice tests is not a great assessment, right? Student voice is a good assessment if you're asking good questions to all students. So you want to know, how deep do they really know? A multiple choice question is surface level. You want to dig deeper than that, so you need to have opportunities for that along the way in your lesson. So as we're writing our lesson, you start with your introduction. I like to think of this as the first sentence in a book or the first couple minutes of a movie. It should hook you. This first introduction into your lesson is your first chance at exposing students to information. You need to get them excited off the bat. You also, in your introduction, you should be doing a couple other things too. You need to pre-assess what they know. You need to figure out what's in their backpack before I send them into the forest. Are they prepared? Do they need some terms defined, for example? So we all have a common understanding of very specific terms. Do you, for example, need a word wall, somewhere, a resource for them to keep accessing that? You should relate it to their prior knowledge, not just because it's fun, but because that's how learning occurs. They need it to connect to a synapse in their brain already. So if, for example, I'm trying to teach about nationalism, well, they may not know that word, but they may know the word patriot. And then I could connect to that. I could ask them questions, scaffold that information. They may not know patriot. They may know 4th of July, and then you can ask why questions and maybe get them there. And then activator, it should be an activating strategy. It should be something that gets them in the right mental framework to be able to learn. A lot of times, especially in our remote settings, students just simply aren't ready to learn when we're ready to teach. We need to make sure that they're with us, and we don't want to run too far ahead in that forest, or again, we're going to leave them behind. So it's just the same as athletes who get out of the car. You don't make them run 5 miles without stretching. You need to warm up the body. You need to warm up the brain too for students. So the other thing I want to caution people this time is to think of the mental state of students, especially those at home. They may be very fragile right now. They may be very stressed, anxious, sedentary. They may be depressed. Who knows? You need to make sure they're okay and comfortable and in a state of which to learn. And patience and questioning and caring and understanding. And in the introduction, can go a long way later. The body is the meat of the lesson. This is the actual journey through the forest. This is where they're going to learn. This is where learning occurs. And learning occurs through who does the work. If I do all the work, I learned everything. But as a teacher, you should already know it. So it is important for the teacher to give that input information. But if you stay there and that's all you did, then those students most likely didn't learn as best they could. You can give the students something to do. You do. That's the students where they're exploring their understanding of the content. This is where they're reading and writing and working it out. This is where they're thinking critically. But they should be using it to do something with. And then we do, ideally in a rigorous setting, you have collaboration, because that is what we want students to do. We want them to talk to each other. Peer-to-peer discussion about content is one of the highest forms of rigor. It's a good way for students to learn. If they're collaboratively working, they're also doing soft skills. We as a class doesn't need to be whole group. That ends up being who's doing the work is I, and it turns into I do if it's just whole class. We as students collectively should be doing the work together. They're dependent on each other. They're accountable towards each other. That's we do at its best. The other thing in the body that you need space for, you need time for students to explore and discuss. If it's discussions with themselves or with peers or with you, it needs to happen. And that exploration needs to be authentic. It should be some sort of student choice. They should have time to explore the content. If you wanted them to get through the forest, but you gave them a couple minutes and then ran and grabbed them and put them in a new forest, well, they didn't learn anything in that forest. So it's also important to understand that time is very sensitive here for them to dig deep and understand really what it is that they are learning. And then finally, we have our closure. This is the puzzle pieces being put all together. In a lesson, it's where are you checking for understanding, but also where are the students proving their mastery of content. So part of that is student choice. Part of that is creating something authentic to them. You also need to close that feedback loop. If you gave out that information in the input stage, it needed to have some sort of cap in where you can see students did something with it. That's where this is. So after we analyzed, after we thought about all the content very hard, we needed to do something with. That's this closure. In general, this is the time for students to prove what they know. We need to ask correct questions and we need to assess what was taught. Oftentimes, we forget that just because it's standard and just because we intended to teach something doesn't necessarily mean it got taught. So make sure you actually are assessing what was taught to see what students know. And then in that closure piece, you need to do something with that information as the teacher. It's not enough to give an assessment. You need to come back to it. So any one lesson doesn't end. You're always going back to the forest. You're always seeing more things. You're always going down different paths. You're exploring. You're taking what you know with you going on and moving forward. But if you just abandon a student in that forest and never come back to them and then expect them to meet you at the end of the year and you're somewhere totally different, well, whose fault is that? It's not the students. So through this whole thing, you should have empathy for the students, and not just students in general, students specifically. This is an individualized thing that you're doing. You're teaching kids. You need to make sure that they learned, and that's where this is.